Hi, this is Gilad Halpern, and this is just a quick message to our listeners in the Bay Area. I will be taking the Tel Aviv Review to the upcoming Z3 conference taking place on November 10th at JCC Palo Alto, where I will be recording a series of episodes with conference guests and speakers. In addition, Noah, Alison and Dawn of the Promise podcast will be recording their show in front of a live audience at the conference. You can use promo code TLV1XZ3 when getting your tickets. Head over to tlv1.fm/Z3 for more details or check out the show notes for a direct link. I look forward to seeing you there.
This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, where we have conversations with authors about their books and research and things that we find fascinating. I'm your hostess, Dalia Shenlin. Gilad Halpern is unfortunately not with us today. This episode is brought to you by the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. It's part of our series on democracy, populism, and authoritarian trends around the world, as well as Israel-Europe relations, Israel-Germany relations, and Holocaust learning. Our guest today is one of the most knowledgeable people about the Israeli media because he's been in it for decades. David Witzthum is a television anchor, presenter of the longtime Channel 1 show From Today to Tomorrow on state television. He began working with the Israel Broadcasting Authority in the early 1970s. He was stationed in Bonn in the 1980s and evolved into a historian of post-war Israel-German relations with a focus on the portrayal of Germany in the Israeli media. He's held more positions at the Israel Broadcasting Authority than we can list here. He's also directed 5 documentary films and published 3 books, including the one we'll be discussing today, called The Beginning of a Wondrous Friendship, The Story of Israeli-German Reconciliation, 1948 to 1960, published by Shokin Publishing House in Hebrew in December 2018. The book will be appearing in German and hopefully in the future in English. David Witzthum, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much.
Your book is not only about the evolving relationship between Israel and Germany in those very morally and politically confusing years after the war. It's also about the evolving narratives and political and social perceptions of each side of the other. Germany towards Israel, Israel towards Germany. Which is the more dominant story in your book? Is this really a book about developing relationships or developing perceptions of one another?
Well, it started, I think, with a pertinent question that I had, all those years, since I was born, perhaps, to a father who came from Berlin. And this question was, how come that Israelis, Jews, the state of Israel, reconciled itself with Germany, after a short time, 7 years after the Holocaust, after the Second World War, Israel already signed a formal agreement with Germany. And of course, the simple answer was, money. Israel needed the money, the reparation, shilumim in Hebrew, and it got the money from West Germany because West Germany needed, the kind of, acknowledgement or, re-entry into the family of nations and so on. And, both sides got what they wanted from that deal. But, of course, that was not real answer. It's a simple answer. It's a shallow answer. But there were so many layers. And I found out that what I read about it was not satisfying, was not telling the whole story. And this is why I think what I did, what other people didn't do before me in that book, is to merge 2 disciplines. One is the discipline of communication, media, that I was teaching at the university as well as practicing in radio and television and newspapers. A
practitioner and a thinker all at once?
Well, much too much. And with the kind of, research in history. And so what I really researched and brought to light in the book was the picture or the narrative about Germany, the story of Germany, of the new Germany, that was publishing in the Israeli newspapers at the time, in the radio, that was held in the public discourse, in the Knesset, in the government, in public fora, and so on and so forth. And I found out that this story was not the story that everyone knew, the story of that Germany, of Hitler's Germany, but a new story, because journalists, by their nature, don't tell the whole old story which everyone knows. They want
they
to
can't keep telling the old
That's
story.
right. They want to tell new stories. And they went to Germany. And I followed through the newspapers some 11 journalists which didn't only tell a specific story at a specific date, for example, elections, visit, occurrence of scandals and so on, but went to Germany to report about the new Germany by a series of articles, yes? People like Amos Eilon, or people like Philip Ben, Robert Welch, Azriel Karlibach, Zeev Laker, Amos Keinan, Uri Avneri, Shabtai Tevet, Aryeh Tzimuki, very well-known, well-established journalists. Many of them knew the language. Many of them spoke German. So they spoke to Germans, they saw the new Germany, and suddenly in the newspapers, in Israeli newspapers, also in the Israeli newspapers who were against reconciliation with Germany, appeared these stories, yes, telling about the new Germany, and the Israeli public got a very, very different picture than it had from the Israeli politicians or historians or others who were telling and retelling the old story about Nazi Germany.
But I feel like you're jumping ahead to the end, whereas actually your book walks us through a very painful emotional process of reaching that stage.
Sure.
It took a long time. I want to start a little bit from the beginning. I mean, not entirely from the beginning, but one of the interesting moments that seem in a way like the lost years are the years between the end of the war and the election of Konrad Adenauer, when what's going on in Germany then? You have the Nuremberg trials and this strange sense of some interest in Germany, but not that much interest in the trials. How did Israel perceive Germany in those bizarre I can't think of another word for them rather than just the bizarre years.
Yes, it didn't. And this is really a beginning. The Germans call it the 0 hour. Yes, it's as if it was a new beginning. It wasn't, of course, yes. But suddenly Germany disappeared. There was no Germany. 1945, Germany was occupied, so there were only 4 occupation zones: the American, the English, the French, and the Soviet.
I think at one point you call it the Israelis saw it as a parking lot.
Yes, so there's nothing. Yes, there's no Germany, so there's nothing to talk about as Germany. There are Jews, in the camps. In the camps, the people who were displaced persons, hundreds of thousands of them, and there were many, many visits on German soil, but not in Germany because there was no Germany. So there was no talk about Germany at all. David Ben Gurion went already in October 1945 to Germany. He went to Bergen-Belsen, he went to Dachau, he went to all these camps and talked to many people, but he wasn't in Germany. He talked to the Americans, the Jews, but no Germany. So these 4 years, the lost years, or the hidden years, served in a way to put a kind of barrier between what happened before until 1945, and after 1949, the new beginning of a Germany, half Germany, yes, West Germany, but a Germany with Konrad Adenauer.
But it's interesting because you explain that on the one hand, there's a bit of a parallel between them. Israel is a new country, or
That's right.
about to become a new country in 1948, and Germany also is establishing itself in a new country, as a new country. It's sort of like a rebirth. So how did Germany perceive itself at this time?
Well, I think it tried to hide the fact that there was a lot of continuity between what happened until 45 and what happened up to 1949. Because, of course, much of Germany was destroyed. Buildings, yes, people, many, many millions of people, were killed, died in the war, were taken prisoners of war and so on. But, German administration, German, social system, German education system, German justice system, and everything. The government was comprised of the people who were there. And the people who were there, many of them were Nazis, former Nazis. So when we dealt with West Germany, with the German government, we dealt actually with many people who were, card-carrying members of the Nazi party. And that was very, very difficult, of course. But I think already it was clear, already in the first year, it was clear that in the person of Konrad Adenauer, Israel has found perhaps the only person with whom Israelis could make agreement. Because there was a very I don't say it's a clear chance, but it was a chance that Adenauer's main rival, Kurt Schumacher, would be elected because he was really a very outstanding opponent of the Nazi Party, spent 12 years in concentration camp, lost one arm and so on, and he was really outspoken critic of the Nazis. But Golda Meir met him in the Socialist International 1947. He was the head of the Social Democratic Party. And she was totally angry because he was representing the suffering of the Social Democrats, of the communists, of the leftists, and almost totally ignored the Jews. So there were rivals or competitors. Who was the victim? The victim. Who was the victim? The real victim? Was it the German left, or were this the Jews of Germany? And it was clear that if he were to be elected as a chancellor, yes, Israel, would not be, on his priorities list. So that was one point. The second point was Adenauer was a Catholic. His greatest trauma was the Prussian domination of the Rhineland, occupation, in the 19th century.
Yeah. And yes. I think you argue that he thought that Germany could never be a modern European liberal democratic country if it would retain its Prussian roots.
Exactly. And then, so, the Catholic state of mind was exactly that. And he was also anti-Nazi, yes, and supporter of the Zionist enterprise, even before the Nazis came. So the Nazis robbed him of his post as a mayor of Köln. And the only person... And
almost deported him.
Yes. And they also arrested his wife, who died afterwards. And he told it also in his book, in his memories, that the only person who really came to his rescue and lent him money was a Jewish friend, Danny Heinemann, a banker who left Germany, but was helping him at that time, the dire time of his. So he remembered that. But he also was a mixture of a man with very strong convictions and moral standing, but I would say held also the anti-Semitic, opinions of most Europeans. And he said, look, and he said it very openly. He wasn't shy of it. He said it in interviews and everywhere. Look, I had two reasons in coming to the agreement with Israel about the reparation. One was, of course, the moral stand, yes, to take the responsibility, yes, and to pay the money or whatever. But the second one, I knew that the Jews have a lot of influence in America, in England, whatever. They and their friends will open to us, the financial doors that we needed, to get credit and whatever. And it was right on both counts.
Interestingly, you could sort of you could look at that moment and say it set a bit of a track for countries of Western Europe and later on Eastern Europe, post-communism, knowing that they have to remember and reconcile with their past with relation to World War II in a way that has become the acceptable taking of responsibility in the West in order to join the Western countries. Yeah. We have an interesting show about that as well. I want to ask you about one of the other themes that I think is, kind of a central part of your analysis of what happened in Germany under Adenauer, which is moving from the idea of a country that is guilty in a collective sense, shouldering collective guilt, to a concept of responsibility. And you describe the actual language of these terms at length. What are these concepts? How did they come about? Were they self-consciously adopted by the leadership?
Well, there was a lot of discussion about it, of course, philosophical discussions. Books were written about it. Karl Jaspers, wrote a whole book about the question of guilt. And Carl Jung and many, many others discussed it. Was the whole German people to be blamed? Also the people who opposed the Nazis? Also the people who really fought against the Nazis? Or what about the people who did nothing? How much were they to blame? And how can you give the labels of guilty, more guilty, less guilty, and whatever? And I think that although in Israel many, many people thought and still think, perhaps even today, that all Germans were Nazis, are Nazis, and will always be Nazis, there was a specific group of people in Israel, Israelis, who came from Germany, who were of German origins, who saw themselves as Germans, because the it was the Nazis who separated the Jews, the German Jews, from the German non-Jews. So, in a way, the thing is, if all Germans are ipso facto, are Nazis, so are we also Nazis? I mean, it's not. I mean, it's absurd, and the whole notion, I think, of common or general guilt, yes, is I think also absurd, and this is what they thought, even in the times after the war in Israel, where Germany was looked at as Amalek, as really the absolute, evil that is staying and remains so, forever.
And you show that this group thought that approach of this complete separation of Jews from Germany was letting Hitler win in a way. How explain that?
And they thought, from the beginning, that there is another Germany, because they said, we left Germany in 1933 and 1934. We know we had friends, we had neighbors, we saw the other Germany. We participated in the project of making German culture, Bildung, which is a concept, that was developed not only by the German philosophers or authors, but also by Jews, like Moses Mendelssohn, like Heine, like others. And they went on in paving the way, yes, and taking part in the negotiations and in the reconciliation process, because they wanted to show to themselves and to others that there were things in Germany, parts of German culture or psyche, that were not Nazis, and there was a possibility to build another Germany. Two Germanys, as a matter of fact. One Germany in the West, others, socialists, went to East Germany. They thought that the real Germany would be built in East Germany. They were, of course, wrong. But this is what motivated them, to go that way. And many of the journalists and editors of newspapers in Israel were also of these Yekis, of these German origin people. And they really participated, not all of them, of course, but they participated in that process.
Well, this I think, brings us to an interesting question about the relationship between the government and media, because Ben Gurion begins early on to open this idea of negotiations shortly after Adenauer is elected and makes his speeches. And he faces huge resistance. I mean, I want to hear from you about the nature of the social and political opposition he faced. And then I'm going to ask you how it came to be that many of the media figures that you describe went along with Ben Gurion on this. Did they do it independently, or were they following his lead? I know that's two questions in one.
Well,
tell us about the blowback first. Tell us about the opposition.
The opposition, yeah. There were two sorts of opposition. One of them which is not very much discussed in recent years, was the opposition from the left, because this was part of the Cold War. The war between East Germany in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet bloc, and West Germany. And, of course, this was the front. Germany was the front. This is where the dividing line went. And the leftist parties, this is still the times of Stalin, yes, were fighting the war between East Germany and West Germany, so they towed the line, the communist line.
The Israeli leftists were towing,
right? And they,
because we still hadn't heard Khrushchev's speech about Stalin's crimes.
Yes. The Israeli, they were so divided. You read now the leftist newspapers. It's absurd. It's absurd how the kind of Stalin, the son, or whatever, the eternal leader, and so on, and they went freely to East Berlin. Many of the leftist Jews who left Germany when Hitler came back to East Berlin. Yeah? Arnold Zweig, for example, of course, other intellectuals, non-Jews also, like Bertolt Brecht and others. They hoped to build in East Germany a new Germany, another Germany, the Germany who fought and defeated fascism. So that was the opposition of these parties in Israel, Mapam, Achdut HaAvoda, Maki, the communist parties, against Ben Gurion, was not opposition against relations with East Germany, but relations with West Germany. They said Adenauer and his government is a neo-Nazi government. Yes, it's the West Germany is a continuation of Nazi Germany.
But in their mind, East Germany was a continuation of the Soviet Union having fought the Nazi regime.
Exactly. I mean,
it's a stretch.
It's a stretch. And of course, we read now the newspapers. I mean, we are surprised. Really, you can't believe this. But in a way, what the West was saying about Stalin then was right. Yes, Stalin really, in East Germany, yes, was really a horrendous system of Adenauer's Germany, and Adenauer's government, and whatever. It was comprised of Nazis or former Nazis. So in a way, both were right.
That's interesting because, the resistance that you point out, at many places you call it an actual boycott. And you can talk about the extent of that boycott of Germany among Israelis, including not even, having the stamp in their passports that says you can live anywhere but Germany. But what you're saying is that it's not a matter of a boycott because of the horrible things Germany did to the Jews, but because of their image of the current Germany being like still that, basically. Not because we have a historic trauma from 5 years ago or a few years ago at this point. We're talking about the late 40s, early 50s, but because of who these people still are today.
Sure. This was fueling, the anger. But of course, the anger, I was talking up to now about the left. But of course, the right, right being when Menachem Begin and Cherut and also the religious parties were against it for other reasons. They said, we can never forget, we can never forgive, nothing Amalek, and we cannot do business with Germany. This is really something we cannot do at all. But what was so interesting in that opposition from the right was that Ben Gurion stood firm, and in order to defend his position, he went into attack. And there was protocol of a very interesting meeting held in December 1951, I think, of the Mapai party, of the government party, Socialist Party. And Ben Gurion stood in front and against two very interesting and important members of his party who were both Holocaust survivors. And shouted at them. He said, you have no right to deprive the Israeli people and the Israeli state of the money that Germany owes us. We won't let Germany get away. It's called Haratzachta v'gam yarashta.
Of course, it's a biblical phrase, meaning accusing them of basically you murdered and then you're going to somehow benefit from it.
Yes. So you don't have a right to do so. So he went into attack. And he defended many historians who wrote about this period, about this opposition against Ben Gurion, said Ben Gurion was an opportunist, he was a pragmatist, he wanted the money, and he didn't care from where and whatever. I think different. I think differently. I think it's not true. I think his moral basis no weaker than the others. But his strongest sense was to, of course, to make everything for the state of Israel. And also this stand of the bit you want to be inheriting, those whom you have killed, yes, I think was as strong as his opponents, if not stronger.
But I mean, I think that your book does a very good job of really evoking this deeply, deeply ideological and emotional force that was going on in this debate. You say there's never been a Knesset debate like the one that took place, I don't know if you meant ever since, but it was a very hours and hours long. And I was struck by a passage by the Speaker of the Knesset at the time, the first Speaker of the Knesset, Yosef Sprinzak, who basically, had a kind of cri de coeur speech where he says, if we do this, if we embark on this path, it's going to be a colossal historic mistake. It's going to lead to complete atrophy and indifference. I'm paraphrasing. In our memory of the Holocaust, even inside Israel. So what was his position? And do you think that ultimately any of what he worried about came to pass?
Yes, I think that most of what people prophesied came to pass. But I think that history is like that. And if you go back to what happened after the Holocaust, and you can see that people after the Holocaust, especially people who experienced the Holocaust, who were survivors or who lost families or whatever, could not come back. There was no going back. Yes, Adorno said there's no poetry after the Holocaust, and others said some things about music and other things, whatever. And I think they are right. I think that this was something that is indescribable. You couldn't describe it. And the question is, what do you do afterwards? Yes? And very, very quickly, as it turned out, few years, yes, in years that I'm covering in the book, these 12 years, 12 years, relation between Israel and Germany went into the normal. So much so that people in Israel and in Germany could, in the course of the 50s, say, well, okay, that's over. But it kept going back. It kept the spectre of the whole Holocaust coming back. And we know now, yes, after so many years after the Holocaust, yes, more than something like 80 years, yes, it's coming back and it's staying. And it is here to stay.
Yeah, trauma doesn't go away so fast.
The trauma is staying. One generation, second generation, third generation, it's not going away. And it has a lot of forms. It's political forms in the psyche, of the political discourse in Germany, not only in Germany.
And the accusations of instrumentalization haven't gone away either.
Exactly, also in Islam, whatever. But I just want to go back to something that you asked before, and I didn't fully come to that, it is the distinction between guilt and responsibility. Because what happened with the reparation agreement, because it was done of a free will of the Germans, a sovereign decision of Konrad Adenauer, it gave him the instrument, the leverage, He could say, okay, we were all guilty, or perceived as guilty, but now we are switching our guilt to responsibility. The past is our responsibility, of our free will, of our free decision, to make amends to it.
Is that a contrast to how Israel viewed or didn't really care much about the Nuremberg trials, which maybe they perceived as an imposed sense of justice?
Well, the Nuremberg trials, you have to remember, were not mainly about the Holocaust.
Right. We forget that in light of history.
That's right, because so much is done of it, because there were a kind of tribunal that the victors, the four powers, made against the people they defeated, the losers. So in a way, Nuremberg was reported. It was important, but it wasn't the main thing.
You described the reporters getting bored.
Yes, exactly, getting bored and whatever. But they reported it, of course. Nazis were hanged and everything, of course. And there was not only in Nuremberg, it was also in Dachau and other places, whatever. Yes, but this was really a kind of after-war thing. And it took place, as you said, in these 4 years, yes, of limbo between Nazi Germany and the new Germanys. And so somehow it disappeared. The real Germany on trial thing, it happened with the Eichmann trial.
Of course, I was going to ask you about that at the end, because your book ends conveniently right before that.
Exactly. So I'm not dealing with it because many books were written about it. Most, of course, famously the book by Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem. So I didn't want to deal with it. But the story of reconciliation ends, already 1960. So it's really that.
Go back to what really is one of your main fields of expertise, which is the role of the media, which I know I asked you about and I didn't give you a chance to answer. Did this sort of group of journalists that you cover, who themselves emerged from German culture, who were covering this, did they observe this new Germany completely independently? Or were they, you also point out that the media was not exactly the independent media we have today. We had state television at the time. Most newspapers were party arms. Do you think that they were choosing also consciously to represent particular political line? Or
very much so. They were, in contrast to what happens in Germany, even today. In Germany, correspondents, journalists, and whatever, who go to cover other countries, foreign correspondents, others, are usually people who begin their career. And they write stories from wherever they are. But in the newspapers, in the headquarters, you have a bunch of people who are the editors or the senior editors, who are experienced people. They sit there, they form the opinion. Every journal or newspaper in Germany has its own line, and the young journalists, really many times try to kind of tailor their reporting to what the line or of the Redaktion, it's called, of the editors is. It's not only in Germany. It's also in France, also in the United States, something, New York Times has its own,
I think anybody who's written for more than one paper says, I'm going to try to pitch to the tone and leaning of this paper.
Yes, but what happened in Israel was totally different. It was the editors of the three main newspapers in Israel, Haaretz, Ma'ariv, and Yediot, were totally against relations with Germany. Not to speak about even about the leftist newspapers. But the independent, yes, also Davar, who was not independent, but they were very much against relations with Germany. Yet, the journalists who went to Germany reported very, very different stories because, they experienced another Germany and the stories were published. One very striking example was La Merchav, which was a very leftist newspaper, very, very much against Germany. Everything against Germany was published. There were poems, there were plays, there were stories, there were op-ed things and everything. Yet they send freelance reporter, who was a very famous Israeli writer, Dan Ben Amotz, to Germany, and he reports the journey of the first ship carrying reparation commodities, from Bremen to Israel. And he sits with the German sailors and crew, yes, who was servicing the ship, was on the ship. He was himself a sailor in his army time, and asked a question which I quoted, as a title: "Can you hate backwards at all? Is it possible to hate backwards? Of course it is possible to hate, but he asked the question like this, and this was published. The whole very, very big kind of feuilleton, piece. And many times I found out that even in the newspapers who were really against Germany, the journalists, yes, were really towing a very different line, writing very, very differently than editors, and they did it totally freely.
Right. I mean, I wonder to what extent that really is a product of that generation, because now we don't have so many people who are Israelis who are emerging from the Hebrew media scene who are also German. I mean, Israel, in a way, also ideologically, Zionism itself is a product of Germanic culture in Europe.
Sure.
I mean, that generation is, basically gone. Israel has a personality that is much more incorporating, hopefully, its Middle Eastern roots alongside its European roots. Could that kind of deep internal understanding of German culture continue to exist these days?
I think in a different form. Of course, even today there are many people who know Germany. But you see, I just 2 days ago read an article in Haaretz in English. Haaretz in English, written by a Jewish journalist who lives in Leipzig. And she reports, for Haaretz, and it's translated. So today, it's not very much so about Israelis going to explore a very different, very far country, but we use very, very many people who live in that country. And today, of course, the whole world is just one global village. So, everyone knows everything about whatever he wants to know about. But what we don't have anymore is a correspondent who, so to speak, gives us from Germany a whole general and complete picture about Germany. I'm sure that people know exactly where to buy, coats, these plastic coats, Uniqlo, in Berlin, and how much they cost, and what color they are, and whatever, and when is the shop open, and so on and so forth. But if I ask them who is the foreign minister of Germany, no one would know. What is the German coalition? Yes,
because this is a different generation of people who are going to Germany for completely other reasons.
Not only no, people know just what they need to know. Yes, they go to Berlin, so they want to know how to go from here to there or whatever. But what do they care about German government? Of course, Germans know very much more about, for example, Israeli settlements or occupation.
Maybe even more than Israelis.
But this is not because they want to know about Israel. This is, I think, in a way a part of the German psyche, to show, yes, that the Jewish people are also doing, some bad things like Germans did to the Jews. This is part of the kind of a what was called in the German discourse the double responsibility. Yes, we did wrong with the Jews. Now the Jews are doing wrong with the
But
with
is
the
it coming from a
Palestinians.
place of trying to expunge their own guilt, or is it coming from a place of saying we have even more guilt than we realize because now we have
Well,
double?
it has a lot of forms.
Yeah.
But this discourse did not start with the Palestinians. This discourse already appeared in the magazine Die Zeit in Germany already in the beginning of the 50s. Yes.
What were they
I
blaming
quoted
Israelis for then?
aggression against the Arab states.
Arab states, right.
Yes, 1948. And it occurred with Helmut Schmidt and his discussion argument with Menachem Begin in the 80s. And it happened with the Greens, and it happened with the German left, and it is still occurring. So, even reporting about foreign countries or foreign culture is always, and that was proven also in research, is always a function of the internal discourse.
Sure. I want to ask you about a completely different topic because your book has a very interesting final chapter which kind of gets away from the politics and the media and the diplomatic relations and moves into the world of culture. And since so much of your book is about journalism, there is, of course, some sort of overlap to culture. I mean, you talk about the role of Kol Yisrael, the Voice of Israel Radio, in broadcasting Beethoven for the first time. Does it take that extra piece of moving beyond, straightforward reporting about politics and media, the overlap between politics and media? Does it take another world of ideas, the cultural world, to help people break out of what was a very, very still strong kind of mental, normative blockade against Germany?
Yes, because, for most of European Jews, the universal culture, their culture, yes, was the German culture. If you said the word culture in German, Kultur, yes, you were talking about Mozart and about Beethoven, about Kant, and about Heine, and about Schiller, and about everything, about Mahler and whatever. So really, culture was German culture. Even people who came from Russia, from Poland, even from France and Holland, whatever. The universal culture was German culture.
And there was no consciousness of a whole group of Israelis who did not share that
Yes.
culture at all.
And perhaps I can quote my father, yes, who said to me, "Look, I will not let Hitler rob me of my Mozart or my Beethoven or my Schiller." And this is, I think, he was right. This was the culture. And so the contribution of Jews to German culture was so great. Without German culture, Israel would have been a barren country. I mean, no country. What culture? Of course, I don't want to insult other nations, of course, not Italian music and not the French, whatever, and the English and whatever. But,
Or Moroccan or
yes,
Tunisian or
but
Yemenite culture.
the very concept of Kultur was German culture. And this was very, very, very difficult, to take it out, of the Jewish Israeli psyche in these years. Everything was so influenced. Journalism was a product, very much, yes, of the German tradition. Yes, I'm not talking about classical music, which developed out of the refugees who came to Israel in the 30s, and so many other branches of culture, but also industry. And also other parts, and also, of course, universities in Israel. The first university, the Hebrew University, was really a German product. And the whole process of what is called Madai HaRuach, Geisteswissenschaften, yes? Humanities, yes, Also in America, it very much developed out of the tradition of German refugees who went in the 30s, from Germany to America. So really, you could not separate the Jews from their culture, which was German culture.
Well, I don't know where this is going in terms of Israel-German relations in the future, but I like to think that media and culture, free media and strong culture will save us. What do you think? Is that the answer? Or is the answer, or maybe for a final question, is that the answer, or is the better answer personal chemistry between leaders such as Ben Gurion and Adenauer? I mean, maybe we need both.
Well, in a way, I've become pessimistic because I think that the German culture didn't save the Germans from Adolf Hitler. And
that's a good point. A sad point.
Yes. And if you read the biography of Hitler, and you see, that how much the man loved Mahler, in his youth, and afterwards Wagner and Beethoven and whatever. The Ninth Symphony of Beethoven was played every birthday of Adolf Hitler by the Berliner Philharmoniker. I mean, really, culture is no guarantee for anything, for nothing.
I did not mean to end on such a pessimistic note, but it's still a fascinating book. David Witzthum, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their support of this series. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just go to the ratings and review section, write us a good one, a critical one, anything you think. We like all opinions. You can support us also by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Please check out our archives with over 500 interviews. If you like us, please like us also on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.